Hello, everyone. I think we are going to get started so that we leave ourselves enough time for a lively conversation. So welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for making the time to be here with us today. Today's discussion will be on accountability and survivor support for sexual violence in peacekeeping. My name is Janine Bressmer, and I am the impact editor at the New Humanitarian. And like I said, thank you everyone for making the time today to join us. I know today might be a busy schedule for those of us who are working in prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment, because it is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence against Women. Which for us at the New Humanitarian, we've taken as an invitation to address the pervasive issue of sexual violence in peacekeeping operations, which is a concern that affects people of all genders. Sexual abuse by peacekeepers remains a persistent and devastating problem despite the UN's zero tolerance policy. Our recent investigations in the Democratic Republic of Congo on peacekeeper fathered children and peacekeeper sex abuse in Central African Republic have revealed that these cases continue to be significantly underreported and that survivors often can feel abandoned or inadequately supported. This not only inflicts deep harm on survivors, but also erodes the credibility of multilateral peacekeeping efforts and international intervention practices altogether. Over the years, the New Humanitarian has conducted extensive investigations into sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian settings more broadly, uncovering systemic failures that perpetuate harm. A landmark investigation in 2020, for which we partnered with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, revealed how aid workers, most of them employed by the World Health Organization, exploited women during the Ebola epidemic in the DRC, demanding sex in exchange for jobs in the response. These investigations are not only important in bringing attention to the experiences of survivors, but they also impact the response to the abuse in helping to push for change. Aid organizations launched internal probes. The UK government scrutinized UK funded groups. Recruitment for safeguarding roles increased, and Interpol initiated a 5-year program to address the issue. The World Health Organization Director General issued a public apology, established an independent commission, and committed to reforms. At the New Humanitarian, the findings that we had are now also part of a mandatory UN training and an investigative journalism guide, ensuring that the learnings of our work are carried into the future across humanitarian programming, as well as in ethical journalism. By amplifying survivor voices and exposing these failures, my colleagues at the New Humanitarian push for sector-wide accountability and survivor-centered change. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by 3 distinguished panelists to discuss the notion of beyond zero tolerance. Each speaker comes from a very different angle and brings a unique perspective on the issue of sexual abuse in peacekeeping and beyond. We have the privilege to be joined by Leah Nyambeki Orwoba. She's a victims advocate and in-country support coordinator at the Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Coordination Unit of the Ethics Office at the Global Fund. Christian Saunders, who is the Special Coordinator on improving the UN response to sexual exploitation and abuse. And Jasmine Westendorf, Associate Professor in International Relations at La Trobe University and incoming co-director of the Initiative for Peacebuilding at the University of Melbourne, and recently co-editor of a publication entitled Sexual Exploitation and Abuse in Peacekeeping and Aid, Critiquing the Past and Plotting the Future. In bringing you all together today, I'm really interested in hearing more about the perspectives that each of you has in your professional work, the ideas, the frameworks, the constraints, and the opportunities that each of you sees for closing the gap in UN peacekeeper accountability and survivor support generally. I will be guiding our conversation today with some questions, but please do feel free to respond to each other and engage in a lively conversation. At around 20 minutes left, we will turn to our audience and take some questions. That means that those of you who are joining online are warmly invited to submit your questions in the chat, and we will pose them to our esteemed speakers. Lastly, this event is being recorded and it will be shared on our website afterwards. So if you need to run, there's no worries. You can catch up with us later. Now, let me turn to our speakers and pose each of you an opening question. Feel free to take a little bit of time. And I'm going to start with Leah. Leah, your work focuses on supporting survivors and coordinating efforts to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse at the country level. Can you share with us what led you to this role and how you see the global fight against prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment evolving on the ground where you work? Over to you.
Thank you, Janine. I think what drove me to this role is that I've always been passionate about victims and victims' rights. This I think, is the path that I have chosen in life. So my background and training is as a lawyer. I have a master's in law, in democracy law and governance. I have worked in the criminal justice system and human rights systems, represented several victims of sexual abuse, trafficking, police excesses. And then I turned my eye into the humanitarian space to see if there's anything distinct or things that we could actually leverage from the justice sector. And for me, it came to the point and the realization that victims are victims. They are impacted in the same way. There's no distinction on how a violation happens to them and the impact that it gets to them because it's a criminal process or a humanitarian matter. The support they need is the same to be dignified, to be recognized, and it will be put in the center of the processes. I think this is what took me to this path. My work as an in-country support coordinator has been to be able to develop structures at the Global Fund that support a victim-centered approach to PACH work, because this was not initially in place, and to be the gap to work with the victims during our response mechanisms throughout the processes that we have internally. So it's trying to make sure that we are ensuring in all our work, we are putting the victim at the center. It's very easy to forget them. Once you have, you've done your witness statements, you've taken out whatever information that you need, it's easy to forget that these issues begin with human beings. And so my sole responsibility is to be that gap, remind all the players and the people involved in these processes from the top to the bottom that they are human beings that need to be supported. So that's how I usually summarize my role. It has a lot of technical work, of course, in terms of policy, the work with the victims directly in terms of case management, but I would like to believe it is the action of centering the victim-centered approach and putting this perspective of human beings at the front. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Christian, over to you. As the UN Special Coordinator, you oversee efforts to improve the system's response to, I'm just going to call it PSEA from now on, that includes peacekeeping, but not only. Could you briefly describe to us how there is a difference between the peacekeeping aspect from other UN bodies in terms of the prevention work that you do? And could you also give us a sense of your current priorities moving into the coming year of 2025?
Thank you, Janine, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. That's right. I mean, sexual exploitation and abuse has existed for thousands of years. It's endemic in every society, and it's across the aid sector, whether that's peacekeeping, humanitarian, or development. And my responsibilities cover the breadth of those different sectors. There are many, of course, many similarities across the sectors, including the fact that we live in a patriarchal world, including the fact that there are differences in privilege and power, including the fact that you're dealing with very, very vulnerable groups, very, very vulnerable people. And this is probably why the risks are significantly higher in the areas that we work than perhaps in normal society, although it happens in normal society. In terms of the prevention and response, a lot of it is the same. But the difference is being that often in peacekeeping operations, you're dealing with troop contributing countries. So you're dealing with member states. And those member states are responsible for ensuring that the soldiers or the police who are deployed to UN operations not only are properly prepared for the roles that they're going to undertake in those peacekeeping operations, including sexual exploitation and abuse, and not just the compliance aspects of why a soldier can't do this or can do that, but also the why of why you shouldn't be engaged in sexual exploitation and abuse with members of the people that you're there to protect. They're also responsible for accountability. So investigations of acts of sexual exploitation and abuse, and then ensuring there is accountability of those soldiers for what they have done. So part of my role is also to look at the overall landscape of the United Nations and the aid and our partners in the aid operations, and to see what are the causal factors of sexual exploitation and abuse, and how can we go about ensuring that we reduce the numbers of incidents as much as possible, recognizing that given that the United Nations is a microcosm of society, that sexual exploitation and abuse is almost inevitable or is inevitable, and we just have to ensure that we keep the numbers as low as possible, and that when there are incidences of sexual exploitation and abuse, that the victims' rights and are protected. As Leah said, that they are put front and center of any process, that they're heard, that they're treated with dignity, that they get the kind of support that they need, but also to push to ensure that people who commit these crimes are held to account. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Jasmine, over to you. Your research has examined some of the critical systemic issues that enable sexual violence in peacekeeping specifically. Could you speak to some of those structural and normative factors that perpetuate and can perpetuate the issue?
Sure, thank you. And likewise, thank you for the invitation and welcome to everyone online. It's great to be a part of this conversation today. My research has looked at this issue of sexual exploitation and abuse in peacekeeping and humanitarian contexts for quite a long time now. And what what I would say about the causes or the structural, the contextual, the normative factors is that often when people hear about sexual exploitation and abuse, they still frame this as an issue of individual men behaving badly, a bad apple or a set of bad apples. And that inevitably leads to a couple of other stories that are told to sort of explain this. One is that it's an issue of masculinities. This is an inevitable consequence of masculinities in contexts where they go bad or produce bad outcomes. And so what we need to do is channel those masculinities into better outlets so that instead of perpetrating sexual exploitation and abuse or sexual harassment, they find other ways of de-stressing or whatever. The second narrative around this is that the best way to deal with bad apples is to teach them that what they're doing is inappropriate. And the problem with that is that it doesn't get to the actual causes, which I would echo Christian, are systemic across societies globally. These are issues of how societies are organized. Wherever there are imbalances of power, people who hold power will exploit that power. And we see it in education institutions, in religious institutions, we see it in Hollywood, magazines, literature, all over the place. The enormous challenge that in the places in the world where the international community is called to deploy to try to provide support to some of the people who are experiencing the worst forms of violence, conflict, deprivation and so on, they are at greatest risk of exploitation. And there is an inevitable and a very great power imbalance between the people who come to provide that assistance and the people receiving that assistance. And so in terms of what those structural causal factors are, the key one is the context. This is a problem of context. And so that means that on the one hand, as Christian said, we have to accept that sexual abuse and sexual harassment are likely to happen in this context. We have to get much better at addressing those and tailoring response and prevention mechanisms to those contexts. The second bit is that we have to understand how the normative and the systemic factors operate within the institutions that aid workers and peacekeepers work within. So how what are the cultures within those organizations that make certain types of behaviors acceptable, whether those are racist, sexist, or other forms of discrimination, whether they are whether they normalize the exploitation on other fronts, so economic exploitation, labor exploitation in households, and so on, whether they allow people to live out pretty colonial attitudes around who have the answers, who has the answers to these various problems, and who should be leading responses and so on, or who are the people who are, to put it crudely, vulnerable brown women who don't have any, who are just vulnerable. So where those attitudes persist, obviously, there's a greater risk that women, children, and others are seen just as vulnerable people, rather than as people who have agency, who have a lot to offer in these very complex political processes into which international organizations step when there is conflict or humanitarian crisis. So I guess what my research has really tried to show is how we need to address those contextual and structural and normative factors if we are really to address the heart of sexual exploitation and abuse. If we just address its manifestation, if we buy into the stories of the bad apples, we're unlikely to really be able to address this issue in any substantial way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm gonna jump around with some questions, but really do amongst each other also, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me as well. I won't take it personally. I'm curious, kind of jumping off of what you just said, Jasmine, Leah, in your work, because I feel often in prevention work along this line, the conversation is around what the institutions need and can do, but it rarely talks about the need of the communities as well. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you cultivate common understandings and engagement on what local communities actually need? Is that something that you can define, or not?
Absolutely. Maybe let me just give an example of a conversation that I had with a woman in Bosnia, a woman who worked with the international response during the siege of Sarajevo, who spoke to me as part of my research. She told me a story about a time during the siege of Sarajevo when she and her family, she was lucky enough to have a job with an international organization. She had children, they didn't have enough food, they couldn't meet their basic needs, and yet she was part of an organization that was trying to provide some support. Under her desk every day in the office was a box of canned food. And she told me one day her need just got so great, she took a can or two of tuna fish home to her children to feed them. And when she came back to the office the next day, she was met by the security director and the head of office, who said, "You've stolen from us. This is a breach of your responsibilities. It's a breach of our trust. It's a breach of our integrity obligations, and so on. How can we trust you? We're not sure, that we can. If this ever happens again, you'll be fired." And she said to me, what they didn't realize is that if my boss had said to me, "Come into the stationery cupboard and participate in a sex act," I would have done it to feed my children. And to me, that goes to the heart. I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question about, how do we cultivate that common understanding? I think when people seek to understand the lives and the livelihoods of the regular people in the communities that they're deployed into. And we're not just talking about international staff, obviously, also. I mean, we're talking about national staff, especially in aid and development context. But when there is an understanding and an empathy about the very dire circumstances that people might find themselves in, that can be the foundations for an understanding of motivations and why those individuals or families or communities might act in the ways that they do, and what their needs might be that are being or that are liable to be exploited by people who wish to abuse their positions of power in order to exploit. And so if it starts with that really grounded human empathetic connection to understand what's actually going on for people, you can sort of skip the more institutional focus to understand what's going on for the communities in which those institutions work. And so instead of focusing on, integrity pathways or procurement pathways, or just focusing from the top down on the safeguarding mechanisms, which are absolutely important, but you need to have that contextualized to understand the factors that are driving risk in communities. And those manifest in very different ways in different contexts, and they interact with existing economies in different ways in different contexts. So, for example, where you have existing trafficking networks, existing sex tourism networks, or existing drug trafficking networks, or hospitality networks that can easily shift gear to start to provide sexual services, to expand their offerings and so on, you end up with a very different picture to in places where that doesn't exist. So really having that grounded understanding, hyper-localized understanding, is where I think there's a bridge between what the institutions need and what communities need, and how those needs can be sort of how they can meet in the middle to provide better prevention and response to exploitation and abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, how does that resonate with you, what Jasmine was just saying?
I really, really resonate with that. I agree. Understanding how communities operate and the systems within those communities and the things that raise the risk enables us to do safer programming. I think the only thing that I've seen in my experience, that in as much as we want to do and take measures of prevention, somehow, unfortunately, something happens. Something always happens. And at that point, when that thing happens, we need to respond. And I think from just the work that I've been doing in the past, reading, contributing a little bit to Jasmine's book, one of the things that I've seen within the industry is that we've done considerably a lot of work around prevention and trying to create structures, policies, and things around prevention. But when it comes to response, we still have a huge gap, especially when it comes to the victim support in itself and the support services. In fact, every time I think about Beyond Zero and what should we be doing, for me, when it comes to victim support services, I would term it as putting our money where our mouth is. I feel like when it comes to support services, that is something that is lacking. We, I think as an industry, have been able to accept that victims who are well supported through an accountability mechanism are willing to participate throughout that mechanism and are most likely going to encourage others to report, which is great. But we also know that once we've accepted this, we are really, as an industry, have not, or a sector, have not put in enough measures to support the victims in a proper manner. And for me, this comes to the issue of, dedicated, consistent, and sustainable funding for victim support services. This is an area I personally feel is lacking. And as long as we don't have that, we will always be falling on the wayside in terms of the things that we are doing to actually respond to victims. And maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, but maybe I'll just draw something from the justice sector. Recently, I saw the ICC in the case of Ongwen. There's the ICC case in Uganda, the perpetrator from Uganda. One of the judgments that was given in that case was with regard to reparations for victims. And the judgment was so critical because they gave specific amounts. They actually dedicated, I think, 750 euros for each victim in that case. And that was part of the judgment. And then they further went and said that we need to provide resources for rehabilitation services to address physical, moral, and material injustices. This is a court that has written this, and this is something that now the trust fund has to actualize. And I feel that it's walking the talk. Of course, it's not something easy. I know the trust fund has about a 4-year program to implement this, but they've actually put in specific things in terms of reparations. I know in the humanitarian sector, the conversation for reparations is actually really dicey. It's one of those areas we don't want to mention. We are still not comfortable. We are still working with remedial action, which is good because remedial action is restoring, correcting a wrong, which is great. And I feel like one of the ways of correcting wrongs is making sure that victims can feel that they are actually having the support they need, and not just in words and things to be done, but actual support. If I need food, as the example that Jasmine gave, if this was something that was needed as a member of the community, why would it be hard for the people involved, the institutions involved, to give that person that food or the money to go and actually get that food? And for me, something that really, I think is not a sore thumb, but it's something that doesn't sit well with me, is that I know because of our internal processes as organizations, big and small, it's very hard for institutions, especially among the UN, to actually give cash support to victims. And this is something that is being deliberated across the board. And to me, what that says is we ask victims to trust us as professionals and as organizations to be able to support them and walk with them the journey of accountability when these things happen. But we feel like we do not have enough trust to place in our victims to give them $20 without asking them for a receipt to buy food. Like, it really is mind-boggling to me. In my country, if I'm going to buy to the market, I'm going to an open market to buy food. So where am I getting a receipt for that? And that is my need. So if we feel, and most often than not, victims will always be asking for the support they need in the assessments that we do is actually what they need. And we need to give them that. And if they divert even the things that we need, is because there's some more pressing need at that point. It's not for fun or for just diverting resources. And to me, sometimes I look at our internal processes and our bureaucratic measures, and I feel like sometimes they're the hindrance. And this is where I agree with Jasmine. Sometimes they're systemic things that are already innate in the sector and in the organizations that we need to address to be able to fully support victims in the manner that we are actually saying we want to support them. We need to put our money where our mouth is as institutions in this area.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. Christian, how do you feel about that response? And I'm sure you've come across, various experiences of survivors, and from the institutional perspective, what are your feelings and comments that come up to the conversation?
I agree with both of those interventions. I think, and particularly now that the levels of assistance globally are going down and the demands on that assistance are going up, the risks of sexual exploitation and abuse go up, and there seems to be less money to support victims. There has never been enough money to support victims, and it's always been ad hoc and inadequate. We've relied on GBV services, and we know that in many, many countries around the world, GBV services are severely underfunded. So I completely agree with that statement. It's almost as if we wanted to go away rather than solving the problem. And I think it's important that we recognize that we have an obligation to victims and we give them the kind of assistance that they need. In terms of Jasmine's comment, I agree absolutely on the context and knowing what's going on with the community. And I think part of the problem is that when you have peacekeepers and you start the training maybe a couple of months or 3 months before they're due to deploy, I don't think you can expect a soldier, an 18-year-old soldier, or indeed an older soldier, to understand the context within that brief period. I'm pushing now for countries who want to serve in peacekeeping that they start the learning of the soldiers when the young men and women come off the street. So it has to start as part of basic training, and it has to be repeated and repeated. And it can't just be the sort of the compliance-based training. It must be a learning and an understanding of the context and of what Jasmine's absolutely right, what's going on in that community. And yes, there are different things going on in different communities. There are different things going on in different individuals or different families. But if we start the training, the basic training, it will also serve them as a country, I think, because eventually it will become part of the DNA of every soldier, every police officer. And when they're called to respond to emergencies in their own country, the populations that they're serving there will also be much safer. So I think it's moving away from the traditional way that we have done it in the past, which we can see and we know don't work, and really thinking about things radically differently. But it's also about funding, and member states have to understand that they have to fund this properly. It isn't going away. It needs to be institutionalized. It needs to be part of. People need to understand it's part of the cost of doing business. So it needs to be funded. It needs to be funded properly. It needs to be institutionalized, and people need to pay attention. We need leadership on this issue, and leadership. We can talk a bit about that now. Leadership is really lacking in this area, in my opinion, and I think it's one of the big determinants as to why we have not to date really been addressing this as we should.
What kind of leadership do you think is necessary?
Well, I think
it's a question to all three of you. Go ahead, Christian, please.
I can go first this time if you like. I think it's leadership across the board. I think it's leadership from the very most senior levels of the UN, but it's across headquarters, but it's also at the country level, both in the civilian, but also in the military. It's command and control. It's commanders believing in this issue, understanding this issue, and addressing this issue on a regular basis with the people that they're supposed to oversee. Same in the civilian side. And until people start to talk about this issue and understand the importance of it, I think we're not going to be very successful in addressing it.
Yeah, Jasmine?
Just picking up on the point about leadership, I would add a couple of other layers of leadership. I think I have observed a range of peacekeeper trainings over the years where the training is phenomenal. The trainers are incredible. The materials are rich and communicate exactly the sorts of things that you would hope in this space. And all it takes is one senior person from that troop contributing country to sit in the corner and make a comment that dismisses the importance, or make a derogatory sexist comment about women. For example, in one peacekeeper training I observed, it all went very well, great discussion, and right at the end, one of the senior people from the troop contributing country said, the thing is, you need to be very careful about those women because they're out to entrap you. And so all it took was one comment at the end to sort of turn around the whole story of that training. And all of a sudden, it's not actually about protection or prevention of SCA. It's about the wily women who are out to entrap peacekeepers in order to gain access to victim assistance funds and so on. Or you might have someone, another training I observed, where someone said, well, if I saw a 17-year-old like that in a queue, I'd be patting myself on the back, if I could, start a relationship with her. So you need leadership at those levels as well. And you also need public-facing leadership. And I think what we've seen in the aftermath of some of the big investigations and, so-called scandals around SCA in the past, 25 years now, so many decades, is that where leaders say, this is a systemic issue, we need to address it, but we need to be honest about why it happens and how it happens. That's going to be a message that means you can then sustain contributions and you can sustain more resourcing to this issue. When that doesn't happen, you end up with publics, in the global public, seeing media reports and advocating for the defunding of peacekeeping or humanitarian work and so on. So we need the leadership in terms of the explanation of why this happens, how it happens, and how it's best prevented, because to go to what Christian said, the level of sexual exploitation and abuse are only going to get worse as we see the decreasing resources available to peacekeeping and humanitarian missions addressing some of the most dire circumstances around the world at the moment. So I'd just point out those extra few levels of leadership that are important.
Yeah, thank you. Leah?
I agree completely with what Jasmine and Christian have said. And I think for me, I look at it in the perspective of sometimes, for example, when it comes to provision of support services, and because we work with the issues of confidentiality and need to know basis, sometimes you'll find that the people, the forefront, the people who are the focal points, the people who are working with the victim, understand the things that the victim needs. And they will actually put in place very good interventions. But because they are not within the leadership structure, they cannot get the things that they need to actually implement the assessments that they've done. And I've seen this from the rural areas. I've seen this from country level institutions to the top global head institutions. So the global team is speaking a different language. The people in the country leadership are speaking a different language, and the person who's facing the community is speaking a different language, and we are all stuck. And there's no communication, and no one is getting the things that need to be done. So I agree there has to be leadership across, listening and influencing both up and down. And I know that's not something easy. I've had to do it a couple of times, and it's not the easiest thing, but I think it's absolutely necessary. One of the pieces that I really wish would be given some time, attention, and resources would be the PSEH networks. And maybe I'm coming from a selfish point of view, but I feel like the PSEH networks in country are such a good resource. They were put in with a specific mandate to address certain things and to pull each other together to be able to support victims, and specifically on support services. But because there isn't that pulling in of resources, because someone seated somewhere else needs to make a decision on whether we can put in $200 to a project that's coming in or whatever, then those networks end up being more personality-led or institution, depending on who's at the helm of that. But if we could have some means of collective but coming together in terms, not just even just of resources and publications, but even just for skills, things that we can pull together and have the leadership at the global level and country levels agreeing that this is something that we can use to drive the PSEH agenda. I think that is a resource that can be leveraged to ensure that victims are being supported, and at the very basic level of that support. I've seen certain organizations trying to have this collective approach. Maybe some of you might be aware, but I know FCDO is trying to do a common approach for its implementers. And one of the things they're talking about is funding of victim support services as a key element. And I know if they're able to do that successfully within the implementers and the countries that they work, that would be such a big impact for the victims and how they get the support services. I recently came across WHO, I think, I don't want to call it program, maybe I'm using the wrong words, but they have a tool that they are creating that is HIRAMS. I don't know if some of you have heard about it, and maybe it's something. And in that specific tool is about, collecting information on facilities that offer critical health services within country and how people can access them. And I was just like, this is amazing, because this would take out the whole aspect of mapping in all. Can you imagine if that tool was functional in all countries, such that I don't have to call all my contacts, like in Uganda, hi, do you guys, can you refer me to this person and this person? Can I get this kind of service, where I can actually go into a system and see which services are in country to the very remote areas, and it's updated continuously? That would go such a long way in just ensuring that victims are able to be referred to the right things at the right time. So if we can pull our resources as agencies, I feel like that would be one way of actually bringing in funding, because we might never have enough funding and the needs might never be cured, but we can use the funding that we have and the resources we already have collectively to be able to drive this agenda and you know, try and restore some of the dignity to the victims. So that I feel like for those things to happen, leadership has to take decisions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm very curious about, you know, as you just brought up, Leah, this whole notion of collaboration across not just platforms and countries, but also institutions. For you, Christian, what is that like? You know, you have to collaborate very intensely with civil society, local governments, other international actors. What does that look like for you, and where are some of the bottlenecks that you're currently facing there?
Thanks, and that's a great question. And maybe just before I jump into that, I would also, I think, Leah, there is also a small NGO in the US that's working on a system also where if you, for example, let's say you have been assaulted in a particular town or village in, to use your example, Uganda, that you can go onto the computer and it can tell you where you can get different types of support close to you, which I think, so there are a few of these initiatives that are starting up. In terms of collaboration, I think generally with CSOs and with the local communities that they collaborate, they're very open often to collaborating on these issues. Although this is clearly in a lot of countries a taboo subject to talk about, but once you get over the initial hurdles of talking about this issue, they're often very, very open to working with you. And we have community networks in many different countries. In terms of the UN system and collaborating across the UN system and the NGO community, I spent a lot of time over the last 2 years trying to bring people together and be as inclusive as possible. But people are still very independent. Organizations guard their independence fiercely, and the transparency penalty is still a thing. People are concerned that if people find out that they have cases, that their funding will disappear or shrink. So getting people to cooperate is an uphill battle. I think we've had some progress over the last few years in that respect, but people are still working. There's no doubt people are still working in their silos, and I think we've got to do much better about working together if we're going to be successful, because resources are extremely limited and getting more limited. And we need to understand that if we protect everybody, we also protect ourselves. Again, working with governments, different experience across different countries. Some are very open and understand the problem. And at the end of the day, it is a sovereign problem, because a country is responsible for looking after the citizens within their borders, but also migrants and refugees within their borders. They have the ultimate responsibility for ensuring that they're protected and kept safe. So it's getting countries to understand the significance of the issues, and also working with them on how to address these issues. So increasingly, as Leah said, we have government people as part of the PSEAH networks, and that's really good. And frankly, that's where it should be. We should be collaborating with them, and they should be leading it. But we have a long way to go. We now all UN agencies and the country cooperation framework, we have language in the country cooperation framework on PSEAH and the importance of prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, and ensuring that when it happens that it gets addressed properly. But it's not easy, but it's a big part of my job, is advocating and trying to get people to work together.
I want to pose perhaps a little bit of an annoyingly semantic question to the three of you, and I hope, Jasmine, you're still with us. You're frozen on my screen. I hope you're still here.
I am still here. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Okay. No, it's just your video. All good. Because sometimes when we're talking about the P in SEA, we are talking about prevention. but sometimes we're talking about protection. And I'm wondering, perhaps maybe Jasmine, you can kick us off from your academic research perspective. Is there a difference? And if so, which one should we be using?
Absolutely. I hope that my video problem resolves. Great. Look, I don't think I am not a stickler for which one we should be using. I think that they're interconnected. They're slightly different in my view. I mean, I think understanding this as work of protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, I think rightly draws our attention to the fact that the nature of deploying peacekeepers or humanitarians into these contexts puts an obligation on organizations to actively take steps to prevent the exploitation or abuse of local communities. And there are mechanisms and steps that can be put in place in order to do that protection. Prevention to me is slightly different. And I think I hinted at this earlier. I think prevention is still largely understood in terms of training. So it's sort of prevention from the organization side. And I think we should be thinking in terms of primary prevention for two reasons. Firstly, because the best way to deal with this is to make sure that women, children, and men in conflict and crisis affected communities aren't forced to seek out transactional sex with peacekeepers or humanitarians to meet their basic needs. Or, I mean, that to me is the lower, I mean, when I say low-hanging fruit, I say that I'm aware that it's not actually low-hanging fruit. It's a very complex proposition. But if we look at the spectrum of behavior that SEA encompasses, there is a push factor there that could be addressed through really careful proactive prevention programming. And we already have a lot of those tools in the toolbox around how emergency support, I mean, as Leah said, cash programming is very contentious, but there's a lot of tools in the toolbox to try to reduce the material vulnerabilities that people experience. The sexual abuse side is obviously more complex, but the prevention on that side is recognizing what factors cause greater vulnerability. Where there are higher rates of conflict-related sexual violence, those individuals are at much greater risk of subsequently becoming victims of sexual abuse, subsequent rapes and assaults and so on, by virtue of their extremely and sort of compounded vulnerabilities that they experience. And so how can we think about prevention in that space might be about how we think about the response to conflict-related sexual violence programming that could then, be more proactive. There's work I know that I and others have been doing around how healthcare workers could be proactive prevention agents in trying to, address some of these issues when they recognize some of the signs. So there's a lot that could be done on the prevention side, but we have to understand prevention to start much earlier, that we're trying to address drivers that are much earlier. The flip side that I want to mention is why I think prevention is so important is not just because it's prevention, but because I firmly believe that no matter how good accountability mechanisms can be, they are never going to be good enough to address the complexities of sexual exploitation and abuse. And we see that in the best, the most stable, the most well-resourced legal systems globally still struggle to effectively ensure accountability for sexual violence, let alone sexual exploitation and patterns of, trafficking and other forms of sexual exploitation. And so our best bet in that sense is to try to prevent those at the outset rather than rely on accountability mechanisms creating deterrence, because that is a very problematic sort of logic that we might be aiming for in some of the or that some people have been aiming for in the work that's been done over the last 20 years, that by creating accountability, we create deterrence, and that is prevention. And I would put a few big caveats around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Almost quickly over to you, Leah, but before I do, a reminder for everyone in the audience, please don't be shy and put questions or comments or something that you would like to pose to our three wonderful speakers in the Q&A of the Zoom, and we will get to you in a couple of minutes. Sorry, Leah, over to you.
I'm not sure I can say anything above what Jasmine has said on that particular aspect, but personally, I agree. I I feel like when we say protection from sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, to me, it seems holistic. It's an end-to-end approach on this particular aspect, as opposed to all other things around gender-based violence and other aspects of sexual violence that might come in. So I do prefer when we are referring to protection of SEH, from SEH, I understand there's a lot of politics around terms and language and things that how we define things. I would appreciate if we have one way of talking about these things for the benefit of the communities we serve, because it's always difficult to explain to the communities we serve some of the things that we mean by the words that we use. And sometimes just because of the socialization in those communities, some of the things we refer to as sexual exploitation or sexual abuse are not necessarily seen that way because of the socialization, the traditions, and the things that come up. So I absolutely agree with Jasmine in the perspective, but I also think that as organizations in this space, we should be able to have conversations around how we speak about things and how we communicate those things to our communities in a manner that is consistent across the board, so that we are not confusing the people that we are supposed to be educating or protecting or serving within the communities that we are serving.
Yeah, that makes sense. Christian, do you have a response, reaction?
I have very little to add to what Jasmine and Leah said. For me, I think the most important thing is that we're clear, and so everybody understands. For me, protection encompasses the response, the detection, and the response, and the whole accountability bit as well. But I recognize that when you use the word protection, sometimes it's not actually clear. The other issue, of course, that I think is important to clarify is the sexual harassment bit. And I think it's important to recognize that sexual exploitation abuse can happen to anyone, anywhere. And this sort of almost artificial divide between whether something happens in the workforce or it happens within the community, I think is, for want of a better word, unhelpful. I think you can have sexual harassment committed by a soldier or a humanitarian worker and somebody from the local community as well. So I think we should, I think for everybody's sake, we should clarify the wording, but we should include harassment in there as well.
Yep, absolutely. I was browsing a little bit through your book, Jasmine, and there was something that I found quite striking, which is not actually something that's unique at all to abuse in peacekeeping settings, but the notion of copy and pasting global north frameworks. And that's something that, at the New Humanitarian, we really try to focus on not just platforming and amplifying the voices of those affected by crises directly, but also making sure and constantly challenging ourselves on how do we try to decolonize our own journalism? How are we participating in ethical journalism? And so similarly, over to you three, this notion of copy and pasting a global north framework, I would assume still quite deeply stays embedded in the practices that each of you are working on, whether it's on research, actual implementation, victims advocacy. I'm wondering if any of you have a response to that. It can be abstract, but feel free also to use concrete examples to help us understand the issue.
Maybe I'll go first since you took the example from my book. I think it's a great question. And I don't think this is something unique to the sexual exploitation and abuse space. My earlier research before I came to this was about peace negotiations, and I came across countless examples where the first negotiating text was a copy and paste version of the last negotiated peace agreement. So I don't think we're talking about something exceptional. I think we are speaking to an issue of how knowledge is produced and held in these sectors. And I think we're seeing that people are under enormous pressure, and they're working often across, at the policy level, across many different contexts. And so they're looking to where things have gone well and moving very fast to adapt those to the new environment, the new emergency that they may have been deployed to. So when I see that, I'm inclined to see the issue with generosity rather than cynicism, that this is an issue of, again, the context and the enormous work that people are asked to do. I think we see it especially in some of the prevention work. I think if you look at the way protection or prevention is done, often it is the same modalities that are employed across different places without due recognition of how they might be targeted to address the most critical drivers, the most powerful drivers in particular context. And I think they work in the accountability space as well. Probably that's the clearest example of where we've got global north frameworks for investigations and accountability and judgment and, and evidentiary levels and so on that are being lifted and dropped into places where they are so inappropriate. Evidentiary standards is probably the clearest when you have people who are seeking evidence in certain ways, and especially for TCCs, where they're actually taking that evidence back to their own jurisdiction to try to see if it meets the various levels to push it through that judicial system. We know that it's incredibly hard in any cases to generate evidence, but especially where people are displaced, affected by conflict, where family networks are broken up, people are moving around, and where their trust in systems are already low as a result of conflict or, authoritarian governments or persecution or whatever it might be. So I think it's a huge risk. I don't think it's something that's insurmountable. And I think probably localizing that work, there are always organizations who hold enormous expertise about what is going on or what the risks in terms of the gender landscape are. And I would say that the gender landscape is the biggest indicator of risk. So around gender equalities, access to sexual and reproductive health services, land rights, property rights, and so on, are the great, they're probably the biggest factors that we could, recognize. And so where organizations are working, they're probably the best to work to. But the other is about contextual safeguarding. The people who are the best experts on what should be done to materially improve their vulnerabilities are the people who are vulnerable themselves, the people receiving assistance, women and children. I think Empowered Aid is rightly held up as one of the real leading lights in this space of working in a participatory manner with recipients or participants in aid and programs. I think it could be used in the peacekeeping space as well to identify what are the things that make them feel most vulnerable or experience vulnerability and how could they be addressed, because it's quite fascinating that often the solutions that those participants are coming up with are not necessarily what experts may have anticipated. Sometimes they're much more simple. They're probably, much cheaper as well in a lot of ways. But if we go to that rather than coming with top-down, risk assessments and frameworks and mechanisms, we're likely to produce much better outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Christian, over to you from the perspective of a big animal.
No, I'm reminded of the phrase "nothing about us without us," and I think it's absolutely right that we still do across the board, not just with protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, but with many things we do in the aid sector. It is this northern frameworks that we bring to bear in our response. And I agree with Jasmine. Sometimes it's not bad faith. It's because that's things happen quickly, and that's what we're familiar with, and that's what we've got. But I think the most important thing is to involve the communities right from the get-go. The other thing I think that personally that I think is important is, again, we need to re-examine this again. I would call it an artificial divide between peacekeeping or peacemaking, humanitarian or crisis response, and development. Because I think that those artificial divides are stopping progress and stopping long-term peace.
I was just going to pose the question to Leah, but I think, Leah, are you with us or did you just jump off? I think we'll give her a couple of minutes to see if she can join us again. I have one more question to pose to us before, there she is. Leah, you with us? Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, my apologies about that. Our power went off,
No worries.
so just trying to reconnect.
Of course. We were just having the conversation around, you know, the frameworks, implementation, up, down, which way do we go? Do you have anything to add to the conversation? I'm sure there's you know, the motivation for me asking this question is around you know, there's a lot of donors who are particularly interested in kind of maybe imposing is, yeah, let's call it imposing certain requirements to acquire funding, for example, and that can include the way in which the organization can then respond to harassment, sexual harassment, for example. And so I'm really interested also in your perspective working on the ground, the imposition of global north frameworks, yes or no?
I think I was very impressed with Jasmine's take of looking at it from the positive side. So I have different thoughts. I think sometimes you do need guidances and things from areas that have already worked well. And those things can be borrowed, no need of creating something new when we have something tried and tested that can be adopted. I think my only challenge comes in how we adopt those things. Because sometimes it's not necessarily the requirements that's the issue. It's how it's being incorporated into the systems and whether or not there's any inclusivity in terms of participation and discussions around that element with the people it's going to affect, the people who have to report on it, the people who have to implement it, the people. Is it even something that can be implemented in the communities that we are working in? It could have worked great in one area, but totally cannot work in the areas that you're trying to implement, whatever that issue is. Maybe I can talk about something outside of the humanitarian space, maybe in my past life as a lawyer. One of the things I remember when I was in campus that one of my professor spoke about and has stuck with me for my entire life. We have the conversations around FGM. And we understand FGM, and of course the downside, all the things that are wrong with FGM. But my professor asked this one time, there are some communities that have a form of FGM that is purely for enhancement of women's sexual pleasure. Purely, nothing else. It's a thing that has been indoctrinated within the community. They train each other as they grow in these communities. And the question was, we have cultural practices that are beneficial to these certain communities, but we have international standards and protocol that say that this certain practice is bad. How do you go to that community to convince them and the people impacted by these practices that what they're doing is bad when it's entirely for their pleasure? So it's I think every time we have these conversations, that always comes to my mind, and I always wonder, what are the challenges in including the people who are affected by these directives into those conversations? What is usually so hard? Because most of the time it just feels like it's the power dynamic. I mean, if a donor is asking something of me and I want this funding because it's going to impact a population of 100 people, and they just want me, all I'll do is check the box on that issue. And so we are not having the changes that we hope to see. It for me becomes a question of the chicken and the egg. Do you want to sensitize and educate communities about the things that you're doing and why it's necessary to do the things and include them in those conversations? Or do you just want to adopt and say, okay, well, for you to get my 10,000 US dollars, I need you to provide me with this policy, with them not understanding the impact. So I think there's a lot of room to have conversations around decolonizing some of these aspects, but I look at it in terms of implement. It's not necessarily the things that are requested that could be wrong. It is how they are done and how they're implemented. That's, for me, is usually a challenge and the experience I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead.
To that. And I know it seems that my internet's playing up, and I do apologize. One thing that I've seen increasingly is when local organizations who are working in partnership with the UN or other international organizations feel that those compliance frameworks are so great that they basically opt out of them. And they do that because not because they don't think it's important, but because they want to focus on their core business of providing services. And, these are usually GBV or, women's network organizations. So they want to go back to their core business. And I can recognize that. The problem is that what that does is it then fuels this sense of impunity. I mean, if you don't have everyone bought into the system, even if people are just finding those compliance mechanisms so hard, then you don't get cases coming through, you don't get the participation, you don't get the visibility of accountability, which then fuels the sense of impunity. And so I think there are really unintended consequences of some of these very top-down compliance frameworks that we should be quite aware of, maybe, work to lessen.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. One more short little question before we take some questions from the audience. I personally always learn best through concrete examples, and I'm wondering if each of us has a concrete example or a lesson learned from other spaces where not necessarily prevention of SEA, but prevention more globally perhaps has worked. Is there examples that we can think of and share with those of us here together online on things that have worked? Christian, something comes to mind?
I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but I completely agree with you, Janine, that when you give people stories, real life examples, that they can relate to, that the learning experience is that much better. If I could talking about a real life example and the need to institutionalize or mainstream this issue across the aid sector. If you and I'm just going to give you a synergy. If you recall, in before the early 2000s, safety and security, whether you're working for an NGO or the UN, was dealt with in a very ad hoc manner, and we thought that we were protected because of the UN flag or because of what we were doing as humanitarians. And then in the early 2000s, in fact, in 2003, you had the Canal Hotel bombing in Baghdad, and you had over 20 people that were killed and 100 wounded. Within 1 year, everybody was paying attention to safety and security. They'd institutionalized it across their various organizations, including the UN. They'd increased resourcing of this by about 500% in some cases. And yes, safety and security across the UN and the NGO sector is not brilliant, and it's not 100%, but it is certainly light years ahead of what it was before that. And I think that's what needs to happen here. I'm not advocating that we need another scandal, but we do need member states and donors and agency heads to understand that this has to become part of your core business.
Jasmine, Leah?
I have two very brief examples. One is a peacekeeping example where a senior member of a military peacekeeping contingent told me how he would keep an eye on the interactions that his more junior male personnel had, and if he noticed that they were becoming friendly, so to speak, with a woman, either in the mission or in the broader humanitarian community or what it might have been, or the local community, regardless of the rules, he would sit them down and he would say, do you understand what this might mean from her perspective or her family's perspective? Do you understand the expectations around this? And he said he didn't take a rules-based approach. He took a social approach to it, to create space for them to have the difficult conversations. And I think that's a really great example. And I think I've seen it certainly in a lot of other contexts, that where people are not fearful of sharing their the things that they're unsure about. And we know that in sexual exploitation in particular, there is a great divergence in what people think is acceptable behavior or where people think exploitation happens. In a lot of the world, sex work is legal and regulated and recognized as work, in other parts. So we have a lot of inbuilt biases. And so creating space for people to talk about those without feeling that will cause them to be labeled, the bad apple who doesn't believe the rules is very important. The second is the Ukraine response. I went to the Ukraine response last year. I spent 2 months there because it was recognized globally as one of the greatest vulnerable populations for sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian crises. And I went expecting, based on all the analyses of those risk factors, to find very significant amounts of exploitation and abuse. And it wasn't the case, because unlike every other humanitarian response, the women and children who fled Ukraine had housing assured, they had visa rights, and they had cash allowances that were provided through very efficient mechanisms. It is a very different context to most humanitarian crises. I'm not pretending for a moment that it's not, but I think it's a very helpful one to look at, because where people have their basic need for housing, cash, and their visa security, their safety in a particular place met, they're much less likely to be vulnerable to sexual exploitation or transactional sex in particular. So I think there are really good cases there. It's just whether or not we want to, look to those to inform the work being done elsewhere, and whether resourcing will follow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great examples. Leah, over to you.
I think personally, when it comes to victim rights and victim support, I think there's been research a lot that has actually discussed the impact of supporting victims through accountability mechanisms. We've had stories. Personally, I know I have had victims who actually reach out to me after a process and tell me, thank you so much for the things that you did. I could never have gone through this process if I didn't have your support. And I think there's enough research out there on this particular issue. I can give one of the things I can talk about, for example, just agreeing with what Christian said earlier, and not advocating for scandals or things to happen. But I know, for example, like even in Global Fund, for them to have set up their PACAH coordination unit, it took a massive case that happened in Ghana. I think that was in 2020, that actually shook the organization in terms of actually reflecting that, oh my God, this is a risk. This is what we have to do. And like actually action and put in place structures for us to be able to be even having this engagement today. And the reason I really commend Global Fund for doing this is that it's easier for implementing organizations to put in structures and work on things as ACAH as opposed to donor organizations. And you'll find most of the times donor organizations will have an approach that we are more concerned with the money, that it's going to do the work that we're supporting, and the programs are run. And any of those risks are kept to the people who are actually running those programs, and not necessarily for the donor. So for me, I think it was such a good eye-opener at the time for Global Fund as a donor organization, and particularly because they are also Global Fund is not in country. It doesn't have in-country presence, because we have the principle of in-country ownership. We give the country the money, they decide what's good for them and implement it. So it's trying to give them the independence. But when it comes to things of SCH, PSCH, these things require more presence and your hand actually in some of these programs, initiatives. And it's hard for donor organizations without looking like they are trying to overstep or dictate terms. So for me, I know it's unfortunate, and even in the research as I was doing in trying to set up certain things, it always seems that when there's a scandal or something major happens, that actually compels institutions to put mechanism in place. I might be wrong, but I haven't seen a place where people just say, my guys, let's just do this thing, it's important. Most of the time, they had a panic situation and then they're like, oh my God, let's do this. So it's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate, but I wish we could get to the point where people understand this is an inherent risk. Just the same way we look at the risks in terms of money, audits and things, this is an inherent risk in the work that we are doing. let us deal with it in that manner and put in the measures and structures that can actually address the risk from end to end without having to wait for scandals to happen.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Let us now turn to some questions from the audience, and there's quite a few. I'm going to just randomly pick a couple, but let's start with one because I think this one is directed to all three of you. So the question reads, what value do you think the common approach to protection from SEH launched in June can bring to your and wider international work in this area, including improved accountability and better support to victim survivors? So this is really specifically to the common approach to protection. Who wants to go first? Go for it.
No doubt some plant from the FCDO just put that question in the chat, but that's okay. I think it's important. Why? Because I think it for two reasons. One is it helps us all pull in the same direction in terms of how we're responding to these issues. But also I think it gives guidance to those people who perhaps are not as far along in terms of their frameworks, policies, and things like that, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I think it's a great initiative, and at least we in the UN are very supportive.
Leah, Jasmine? Leah, you're on mute.
I think I had mentioned it earlier in my conversations. I think for me, anything that brings people together and form of collaboration and understanding of things that we are doing, it actually is good, not only in terms of having a standard approach to things, but also in trying to push a specific agenda forward. I think sometimes there's power in numbers. If we can come together as a group of people with an interest in a specific thing, I think it's easier for us to advocate for the things that are required. And for me, the common approach, I think I'm very happy with it specifically because it speaks directly on dedicated funding of victim and survivor support services from the top from the global level and also to the country level. To me, that to me is a big deal, considering the number of countries that FCDO works at, the fund and the implementer organizations they have. So I'm all for it. I know Global Fund contributes to that community and the work that has been done. I know we sit in some of the working groups in that. I myself was in one of the working groups, but I am all for it. Anything that brings people together for a good common agenda, I'm a fan. Yeah.
Do you agree, Jasmine?
I agree. I have nothing further to add.
Nice. I have another question, which is specifically for the UN, I believe, but feel free to chime in if you want to. What action does the UN take when an investigation substantiates the findings of sexual abuse? Christian?
Okay, great. Thank you. Great question. Two different things. It depends. If the abuse is criminal in nature, like rape, then it will be referred to the local authorities to pursue criminal action against that particular person. If it doesn't rise to the level of something that is criminal, then it is dealt with through administrative disciplinary action within the UN. And for anything to do with sexual exploitation and abuse, it will be dismissal from the organization. And then your name will go into ClearCheck, which is a system. It's a database that we maintain so that you would then not be employed by any other UN agency going forward.
Thank you. And following up on that, actually, there's another question which I think is very interesting. It's someone who says that they've seen a lot of research about accountability, but not so much about reports and systems of reporting. So they're wondering, how do people report SEA incidences, both on the country level and on the ground? And they're wondering, is it mostly aid workers? Is it soldiers or commanders? So mostly around the reporting prior to any of what you just said, Christian, when that happens. Feel free to jump in, anyone.
I can, if you like, I can start. In terms of reporting, it's very difficult, from my experience, it's very difficult to get soldiers to break ranks and to report outside their units. If there is reporting, and there is a real dearth of reporting, it will be up through their chain of command, and they will try desperately to keep it inside their unit and address it inside the unit. And I think it's similar with formed police units as well. There have been exceptions to that, but they are very rare. In terms of civilians, and there are more cases of civilians committing sexual exploitation abuse than the military. There are different mechanisms in different countries that we try to keep in context specific, and it could be face to face, and people generally prefer to victims and survivors prefer to report face to face. It can be through email, telephone lines, complaint boxes. I think we need to do much better. I don't think we do that part in terms of complaints mechanisms as well as we could, and we need to. Often also there are too many telephone lines because, again, people are afraid of the transparency penalty, and they like their own complaints mechanism, and I think that's confusing. And we need to, as I said, I think earlier, I think we need to break down the silos and work much more closely together on these mechanisms for complaints and for referrals. And then just lastly, WHO does it, and we're going to start to do it now, is WHO posts on their website accountability measures taken against civilian staff. And I think this is a really good practice, not only because I think it's important that people see that accountability is happening, but also I think it helps with prevention.
I see you nodding along, Leah. What is it like from your perspective? Do you agree there's such a thing as too many phone numbers?
Yes, I agree. There is too many of everything, but it's understandable because people are operating at different levels. And we work within vulnerable communities, so they will be already marginalized in a certain state. So having all these things also becomes a bit confusing. So I wouldn't say I think it's just that there are too many mechanisms to report. Sometimes some are accessible, some are not. And it's much more easier for victims to report to people they know and organizations they see closer to them, as it would be, unlike me trying to reach a global fund at the top. So I agree with everything that Christian has said, and I don't think I have much more to add on that. But before you go ahead, I had seen a question on what does an intersectional approach to accountability and survivor support look like? And I just wanted to address that a little bit. I think it is very important. Intersectionality is very important, and I think it's something that is being adopted a lot in different areas. When it comes to survivor support, it is it's important because intersectionality acknowledges that violence and trauma cuts across diverse experiences. It cuts across race, it cuts across socioeconomic status, it cuts across sexuality. It affects diverse communities. So if we are acknowledging that, then when we are creating our mechanisms, we are able to acknowledge that diversity. We are able to create policies in a
We may have lost her. Oh no. We'll give her a minute to come back. We can pass the time. There you are. You're back. Leah? No? Jasmine, do you want to jump in a little bit from your perspective while we get Leah back online?
Maybe if I could just go back to the question about reporting. I mean, my answer, I mean, I would echo everything Christian says, but I would say quite strongly, people don't report because they don't trust the systems or because they don't know how to report. I think that came through very clearly in the most recent investigation that the New Humanitarian did in the book that I've just edited. The amazing team clearly documented a whole range of problems, with the many phone numbers, that they don't work. It takes a victim survivor a significant amount of bravery and confidence to even take the first step towards reporting. And so if that first step is not received, if that's not received well, if they don't feel trust, if the phone line is down, if someone says, well, why would we believe you, or if they would say, well, did you get money for it? People will immediately, that news will spread like wildfire and other people won't report. I think we know that, maybe 10% of cases are reported. There's a vast majority that aren't reported. In a survey that I've just completed, which is specifically about aid workers, humanitarian, civilian peacekeepers perspectives, so not military peacekeepers, a lot of people had attempted to report things at different times, and those reports hadn't made their way through the accountability process in a way that people felt was fair, honestly reflected the gravity of the situation and resulted in a good outcome. And that then leads to also a resistance or a distrust in the reporting. The other thing I wanted to say is that often when people do report, they report horizontally to trusted individuals, not necessarily to reporting mechanisms. And what's really hard at the moment is that the system puts an enormous burden on victim survivors themselves, reporting through official mechanisms and consenting to be a part of investigations processes. And that's a huge deterrent because we know, as I said before, even in the best legal systems, the cost to victim survivors is enormous, and often they experience breaches of trust even in those legal systems, let alone in places where where the challenges are even greater. So I think there's a lot of reasons why people don't report, and that's why I would say we shouldn't be focusing on the accountability and the investigations mechanisms alone. We really need to be understanding how we can build up trust so that people can report in more flexible ways, and so that we can remove the burden of those processes from victim survivors and put them on others in the system, bilateral reports or, third-party reports and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Leah, I want to give you a chance to finish your point on the intersectionality of it all. I'm so sorry that we lost you there.
I'm so sorry. It's really raining in Nairobi, and with that, it always comes with its challenges. So my apologies about that. But I was just saying that it's important to have intersectionality when considering these policies, because it ensures that your policies are inclusive and they are taking in all the factors that need to be taken in. That way, they'll be more empowering to the people who have to implement the policies and the people whom it will affect. So that is my summary. I don't know where I lost everyone at, but that was the summary.
No, but thank you for bringing it up. So far, I hadn't mentioned intersectionality, and it is something that's actually very important for this to be a holistic approach. And rather than just, as Jasmine said, not just focusing on accountability, for example. We have just about 3 minutes left. And I'm wondering if maybe I'll take one part of a question that someone had posed, rapid fire perhaps. Are there any shortcomings to right-based approaches to SEA? Tricky question, I know.
Sorry, could you say that again, Ginny?
Are there any shortcomings to a rights-based approach to SEA? Putting you on the spot.
For me, the only shortcoming to a rights-based approach is being able to meet those rights. And I think very often, we're unable to meet those rights.
Yeah, fair point. I see you both nodding. Leah, Jasmine.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And I think that a rights-based approach is the right approach because it does put at the center the people whose lives we're talking about, people who experience and are abused, exploited, or harassed by others who are supposed to be part of, international humanitarian or peacekeeping responses that do precisely the opposite. So I think without a rights-based approach, you end up with an approach that disappears from view those people, their lives, the choices, the experiences that they have. And if you don't have that in picture, you can't have prevention, you can't have accountability, because investigations processes fail, because efforts towards prevention aren't adequately targeted. So I would agree completely.
Yeah. Leah, last words.
Yeah, I agree on the issue of implementation and resourcing about when it comes to a rights-based approach. But I think when I shift my mind back to the lawyer that I am, I think the challenge I see with the rights-based approach is that it creates an adversarial system, because it's the people with the rights and the people to implement the rights. So it becomes adversarial, who's not doing what they're supposed to do, which sometimes might not take us to the space that we want to be. I mean, given the whole discussion today. So I think to me, those would be the only two challenges I would see. But I think it is a better approach, actually, to ensure that we are having rights-based approach to the incentive policies and the things that we are doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said is our last words. And we have now run out of time. So I want to thank all of you, to our panelists, to Leah, Christian, Jasmine, for taking the time to speak with us today. And to our online audience for engaging in this critical conversation, which is not just a theoretical conversation. We tried to give you also some concrete examples. And as we said at the beginning, there's real lives that are impacted by the actions or inactions of peacekeeping missions and the international organizations that are running these operations. I really appreciate the candid nature of the discussion today. And do go to our website on the New Humanitarian to check out our coverage on SEA, not just in peacekeeping, but also in other humanitarian contexts. Sign up for our newsletters if you wish, and follow us on social media to keep up to date with humanitarian crises around the world. On behalf of the New Humanitarian, thank you so much to the three of you and to everyone who joined us. And have a lovely day, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.